Hi everybody and welcome back to my channel. We've got a bit of a different intro today. I've actually got you set up where I would normally set up my overhead filming. Today I'm going to show you how to add slash pockets to almost any trousers, almost any skirt, some dresses if you've got a dress with a waist seam. The only difference would be if your pattern maybe already has pockets or has some detail in the area that we're going to put the pockets in. You might need to adjust for that. Other than that, I'm trying to think if there's any kind of patterns that it wouldn't work in, and I can't think of any off the top of my head. So if you're unsure whether it would work in the pattern that you're trying to add it to, feel free to drop me a message. You could pop a comment down below, comment to me on Instagram, and I can let you know if it's going to work or not. Anyway, so I'm going to be adding the slash pockets to my Riviera trousers pattern. That pattern does have side seam pockets, but on the actual pattern itself, the only thing that indicates that is some notches, so I can just completely ignore that. I think that is everything you need to know. Obviously, I'll show you what you're going to need. I'll show you how I'm going to adjust the pattern. Yeah, let's get into it. So of course, the first thing that you're going to need is your pattern. With this one, there's a lot of lines because I'm going over the size 12. So I'm actually going to trace this off so it's a little bit cleaner for you guys to see what I'm actually doing. I'm going to trace it off with a Sharpie to make it easier to see. But you just need your front trouser, your front short, whatever you're using. You're also going to need a pen or a pencil to trace off your pattern. You're going to need some scissors to cut out your pattern. You are going to need a ruler of some kind. Now this is a pattern master. You potentially will need a tape measure just to measure how big you want your pocket to be. And then lastly, you will need some paper. Now I will be showing you how to sew this as well, but this is all you need for the actual pattern. I'm actually going to have my pattern paper upside down because this side is this is a new pattern paper. This side is kind of waxy and it makes my pen smudge sometimes, so I'm going to be using the wrong side of it. Anyway, I'm going to trace off this pattern onto here and then I will show you from there what to do next. Okay. So now here we have the front of our trousers. Now I've added the notches just because that's the current pocket opening, just so you can kind of gauge an idea of how big you want your pocket opening to be. But this is essentially the front pattern piece, and here is our tuck lines. I've added them in because you're gonna wanna know where any details are on your pattern so you can avoid them when adding your pocket. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is add your seam allowance. So draw your seam allowance in because you don't want to take your seam allowance into account when you're adding the pattern piece in. You'll add your seam allowance back in again afterwards. So you don't need to do it the whole way around. You can just do it where you're actually going to be inserting your pocket. So I'm going to do it across the top, and then I'm going to add the seam allowance to the side because our pocket will run down the side. Blue line shows the seam allowance, black line is where the pattern is that I've just traced off. Now, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to measure on your body or on a mannequin or whatever, how far you want your top opening of your pocket to come across here. Now, I tend to finish mine about 1 centimetre away from the tuck. So that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to mark that point. So 1 centimetre away from the tuck, and I've just marked that like so on the seam allowance line. And then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to see how far down you want your slash pocket to come. And I'm going to do it probably about 2 centimetres below that notch that's already there. So my pocket is going to open this much and then it's going to come this far down. So then you want to join those points up on the seam allowance line like so. So now that is going to be our pocket opening. You can see it starting to take shape. So this is going to be our trousers. This is the line where our pocket will open and our hand will just slot in there. So you can check if that's right by popping your hand on the pattern. You're also going to want your actual pocket bag, so the bit that you don't see that's attached on the inside, you're going to want it to come just a few centimetres over, just so that you've got something to attach to this top seam allowance here. So measure a point just over on the seam allowance from your last one. So mine is 4 centimetres over. It's not an exact science. It doesn't actually matter how far you go over. Obviously, if you go really far over, you're going to have quite a lot of bulk of your pocket sitting on your leg. If you kind of just go here and then maybe about the same here, you're going to have a much smaller pocket. So measure about 4 centimeters over, and then on your side seam, I'm going to do another 4 centimeters again. So they're the points where my pocket will start and finish. So what I'm going to now do is just draw in a very simple standard pocket shape. There's no exact science to that either. You can do exactly what you want. Just remember that when your hand goes in here, you're going to want it to be big enough to actually fit your hand in, or whatever you're going to be using your pocket for. If it's purely decorative, it's not going to matter too much. So I'm going to draw in a kind of, now I'm doing this with pen, so I'm going to do a quick sort of outline, and I'd say that's about the right pocket shape. That's big enough for me. I think that's fine. So what I'm going to do is just match those points up and kind of neaten them off around the edges. So that's really all the pattern adjustments that you're going to need to do. It's the tracing off that's the important part. So you're going to need another piece of pattern paper or greaseproof paper or whatever you have, and you're going to need it to be at least as big as the pocket with room for seam allowance. Then you're going to need another piece again, the same sort of size. So I'm just going to cut off the excess that I've got here. So now what you're going to want to do is you're going to place your pattern paper on top of this section. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to trace off this section here, right? So I'm going to outline that in black. Ignore the seam allowance still. That could have been neater, but don't worry. So this section here is what you want to trace off. Pop your pattern paper over the top. Now I will do this a bit neater when I actually make a piece. So there's my first pattern piece traced off. Now, what I would consider doing is, in a minute, we're gonna add the seam allowance, and then I would add some notches onto this and your main piece and the next pocket piece that we're gonna trace off, just so that you can match all the pieces up when sewing. While your pattern piece is still here, you're gonna wanna add your seam allowance back onto it, the same as what is on your actual front. So you've got your side seam piece there, you've got your top piece there, just added in, and then add your centimeter seam allowance here along this edge as well. And then you can add it the whole way around the pattern as well if you want to, but obviously that's up to you. You will be sewing there, so if you want that to be your size, then add it in. Right, so there is now my pocket pattern piece. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that my tuck runs all the way down here. I don't know whether you can see it on the camera, but my tuck is here. If I want this edge to still be 4 centimeters and I want this to still be the size that it is, leave it as is, because you're gonna fold your tuck and this is gonna come and sit just a little bit further over. It's not gonna really make much of a difference as long as this piece doesn't go all the way across. If you want to, you can draw your tuck lines and then fold the piece together. That'll make it so that it's a bit thinner, but I just leave it like this and I find it works absolutely fine. It just means that obviously when you're sewing your pocket, the top seam of your pocket, you're gonna be sewing across this tuck, that's all. So that's your first pocket piece. Add your grain line in, always add your grain line. Mine actually follows the front tuck, so I'm just going to add it in like so. Now there is your first pattern piece, so we can pop that aside. Now remember I said that you're going to add another pattern piece. This time what you're going to do is you're going to ignore this line completely and you're going to draw your other pocket piece in here. So that will include the trouser piece, okay? So this time you're going to have all of this, right? Including the bit you just did. So pop your pattern paper back over the top and then we're gonna trace that piece off. So again, you don't need to add your seam allowance yet, you can add that afterwards. So there we have our next piece, and I'm gonna add the seam allowance exactly the same way I did before. 1 centimeter on the top, 1 centimeter on the side seam, as the pattern already has, and then 1 centimeter around the rest, because that's what I added to my other pattern piece. Okay, and there is your next pattern piece. So again, you're gonna wanna draw your grain line in. And there you have your 2 pocket pieces. So that will be on the inside of the garment, and then that one will sit on top. So now we're gonna need to make some adjustments to the actual front pattern piece as well. So I'll retrace this without these pieces so that I can then show you, because that will make it a lot easier to see what I'm talking about. Okay, so now here is our piece that we had before with our seam allowance drawn in and our pocket pieces drawn in. I've just taken away all those straight lines that I drew on. I've also ignored the tuck in the main trouser. Now, your main trousers, you're gonna wanna trace off everything except this section. We'll do it without the seam allowance again and then add it in. So you can completely ignore this pocket piece now. You just want to go up your side seam, and instead of carrying on and doing this part of the side seam, you're just going to cut straight across here and then across here. So this section can be completely ignored now. Again, do it without your seam allowance and then add your seam allowance after. So remember, go straight across with seam allowance there because that's what we did before. Follow the seam allowance from your side seam, follow the seam allowance along the top, and then you'll follow round your fly. So you will also, because this is your main trousers now, you're also gonna need to draw your tuck back in on this one. So I've got lines here, so I'm just gonna briefly draw it in just to show you. Obviously, if you're tracing off your actual pattern, you'll already have these bits and bobs that you can trace off. I've just retraced it to make it easier. You'll also have somewhere around here, you'll have your circle. Somewhere around here, you'll have your notch. And then that is what your front pattern piece will now look like. You've got your other pattern piece here, which sits on top of that one. And then this one sits behind, like this. Now remember I said about adding notches in, this is why you might want to add some notches in. So what I would do for this is go back to your original pattern piece, just imagine this doesn't have all of these squiggles on, and just add a notch just here in the seam and then just here somewhere next to the tuck. Then what you'll do is you'll lay pattern pieces over your original, add that notch in on both pieces. That notch there, and then do the same again on your new front. So you've got a notch there and we've got a notch there. Now that's pretty much it. In terms of cutting, these were a cut a pair or cut two mirrored anyway, so they will still stay exactly the same. You'll also want to cut a pair of these. I always call this my pocket bag and this one my pocket facing, and I don't know which one's actually meant to be which. So you're going to want a pair of them because you're going to want one for each leg, and then you're going to want to cut a pair of these as well. So now I'm going to cut around my pattern pieces that I've got my seam allowance on, and then cut them out of my fabric, and then I will be back. Okay, so I am back. We have my front piece. Obviously I've just done a short piece and I've only cut one because this is just a sample to show you. Now if you're making the Riviera trousers, you want to sew your tuck first. So I've done that here. We've got the front piece here. Obviously this is where our pocket is going to go, and I've done my front tuck already. Now we're going to want this piece, the piece with the slant. So this is going to sew on here. We want to go right sides together, matching up this edge. And then remember we put the notches here and here. We can match up them as well. So those pieces are together, and then we want to sew them with our 1 centimeter seam allowance just along this edge. Okay, so I've sewn this with a darker thread just so you can see, but I've sewn my pieces together here, and then if I was to open them out, they would look like this. So now what we want to do is understitch and trim our seam allowance down. Whenever you're understitching, you're essentially sewing as close as you can to this seam on the pocket side, not on the main garment. You want to sew the seam allowance down onto either pocket. Sometimes it's a facing, sometimes it's a lining, but in this case, you're going to be sewing your seam allowance to your pocket just along this edge here. Once you've done that, give it a good press and then trim your seam allowance. Okay, so from the right hand side here, you can see just about that I've sewn the seam allowance there. Now we're going to need your other pocket piece. Place this right sides together onto your pocket, and you want to match up the notches of your pocket at the side seam here and at the top here. And then you want to pin all the way around the curved edge of your pocket. You can ignore this side because that's going to be open to open our pocket out. So you just want to pin all the way around here until you get to the side seam. So once you've done that, you now want to sew from this point all the way to here. Once you've done that, you can then also overlock that point as well. So I'll go do that and then I'll show you in just a sec. Okay, so now here is where we're at. I've just sewn and overlocked very roughly, actually, around the edge. And that's pretty much it. So you'll treat this whole pocket as one piece. Fold back along the line here, and then just pull out that piece you just sewed in the back. And there you have a slash pocket. So now there is your pocket, look. So now what you wanna do, just to secure it before you carry on sewing the rest of your garment, is just sew along the top here to secure, and then sew along side seam to secure. I'll show you from the wrong side. Sew along here, press this, and then look, there's your pocket. Once you've sewn this area and this whole piece now will just be treated as your waist seam as normal. This whole piece now will be treated as your side seam as normal. So keep this pinned or sewn in place. When you turn it over to the wrong side, this is what you're looking at, and there's your pocket bag. And that really is it. That's how you do a slash pocket. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know what you think of the format, whether you like this kind of talking as I'm doing it or whether you prefer the voiceovers. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.